Hello and welcome again to the next instalment in these introductions to the DigiPlace transnational cluster. This one is a preparation for the session on the IAP Roadmap, so the session on the morning of the second day on the 17th of June. So today in this session I'm just going to go through briefly introducing what the IAP Roadmap is and how we're going to use it in the session and how we're going to approach it as we go through our project. So the roadmap, the Integrated Action Plan roadmap, effectively describes the route to your finished IAP. So it's defining your local project plan and your DigiPlace activities as we work through together over the next couple of years as we all produce our own Integrated Action Plan in our individual cities. So it's really just looking at how you get there, the activities and the steps we need to go through in order to build that final plan. It's worth saying up front that this does sort of set out the direction of travel in the roadmap, the main waypoints, the main milestones, but not necessarily a completely specific set of directions because you can't predict every single twist and turn along the way. So just to explore this, some people certainly have been feeling a little bit like this guy in terms of the what the roadmap is and how we get our heads around it. But essentially, it is just the route that leads us to our final plan. So we're starting off now. If we are feeling about a bit like this, going to do a bit of thinking, a bit of conversation. We're going to have to do a little bit of work, but eventually we'll then end up with a roadmap which just sets out the route and the stages and the activities that we're each going to take in our individual cities. And this really just allows us to think about what it is we're going to do as we go to produce that integrated action plan. How do we get to that point within the next couple of years? And so the roadmap is just setting out what are those milestones and how do we move between those different things in order to build that integrated action plan. Now, in the previous video and previous session, we've talked a little bit about what an integrated action plan is. And I introduced this definition just to explain a little bit in terms of being a set of actions created in cooperation with stakeholders, which when delivered in a combined and coherent way will create desired changes within a city. And alongside that, in terms of defining what that, some of what that meant, I shared this list, this paragraph with a list of things that might be included in a plan in order to bring it about in the right way. So if we sort of put those through as a set of contents that we want to have in our plan, we need to create integrated action plan roadmaps that describe the steps in the process for us to create all of those different items so that we can build them into our final IAP. So it's important to understand what an integrated action plan is if we're going to build a roadmap that tells us how we're going to get there. But the roadmap needs to just make sure that we can tick off each of these things and say, yeah, we've got that, we understand how we're going to build each of those components of the final plan. So the roadmap effectively looks at three main stages in that process. First, we need to define our starting point. Where's our baseline? Where are we starting from today as we set out on this journey? What's our end point? What are we trying to get to? And there we just need to plot the route between the two. And once we have our roadmap, then we can start the journey. So what are the pieces of that roadmap then? Defining our starting point. So what I'm just going to explain is the blocks of activity, the main stages we need to go through in terms of building our action plan, and therefore these will form key points within our roadmap that we need to think about as we go through how we step through each of these stages. So the first one, which we've in a lot of ways started already or done a lot of already, certainly through the baseline work and the work we've done so far in DigiPlace, is just defining the context. So understanding where we're starting from, what different areas and themes we want to focus on, what some of the local needs and interests are, what is it, how does it fit in with our local city plans that are already in place. And then the other part of that is really exploring the problems we want to tackle. Where do we want to see change happening? What are the challenges we've got? Or indeed, what are the opportunities we want to take? But being really explicit in defining what it is that we're going to actually tackle through this action plan. So we know what is it we're trying to change from our starting point. And at the other end, it's then taking that and turning it on its head to define the end point. Where do we want to get to? So that's about defining our vision, saying here's something that we can communicate, and we can paint a picture, describe a picture of how we're going to be in a future situation. Once we've delivered our integrated action plan, what does the world look like? And then to get more specific about that, to define our specific objectives in terms of what exactly it is we want to achieve with our action plan. So that gives us our route from where we're starting from today and where we want our action plan to take us at the end of it all. They're the sort of the first bits of the puzzle we need to put in place, and they're sort of the first blocks of activity that we need to have in our roadmap. And then the next bits we need to do is we need to plot the route between that. So we need to do all the things that we talked about in that list that will allow us through our action plan building to get from one to the other. So in terms of the specifics then, how do we walk our way through from that point to the draft integrated action plan? Starting off having got some objectives and a clear vision, it's then looking at those ideas. What are the different things we could do? What are the different ideas we could try? Well, how do we explore what the possibilities are in terms of the various ways we could achieve those objectives that we've defined? We then need to turn those into more concrete actions. So an initial set of actions that we think we can take that will lead us down the road to achieving the objectives that we've set out. And from those actions, we can then start to think about how can we ensure they're the right ones? How do we test them? And this is where the small scale actions bit comes in. It's thinking about how do we define and test some of those actions on a small scale to sort of build evidence and see what works and what doesn't. And that allows us to gain insights, to gain data, to get evidence from trying out some of those actions, and then to refine them further, to go back and think, okay, how could we tweak them? How could we adjust them based on what we found out from testing them out on a small scale? And all of that then pulls all together to allow us to put something together into a first draft of our integrated action plan. Now, at this stage, I've not gone beyond that first draft because we need to talk further about what the latter stages of that look like. But essentially, once we've got to that stage of having the draft action plan, we've got over some of the biggest hurdles of working through this. We've got a clear direction of where we're trying to get to at that stage. So the roadmap, as I've described it there, has these sort of 9 broad steps to make it happen. But how we carry those out, that's another part too. So this is kind of a simple framework to set out and help to communicate what the key stages are, what the key components are we might need in our roadmap, and the key activities we'll do in our route to our action plan. But there is another part to this as well that we need to add in. So whilst these are the main blocks of activity, we do need some detail underneath it as well. So the activities we're going to use to achieve all these things need to be sequenced, and they need to be resourced. So we need to know what we're going to do when and how we're going to make sure it happens. And we also need to consider the links between all the different activities as well. And that's also pretty crucial, particularly as we've got different levels of working in terms of local level, transnational level, and so on. So we need to be thinking about questions around what exactly will happen, when will things happen, who's going to be involved, what resources do we need, and what other activity do our actions affect? How does everything link together and interplay with each other? So what we need then is a slightly more detailed plan that sits under that framework. And one of the things I've shared with you on some of the conversations so far, and that we'll recap and we'll reuse going forward, is this DigiPlace IAP Roadmap canvas. And this is effectively just a way of starting to plot out what some of the different things are that we're going to do across a timeline and across a different streams of activity. And this is where we start to get to some of the detail. So just to walk through what we've got here, we've got the top line, in which we've started to think about some outputs. So what are we actually producing as part of this activity? So some of the things in there include sort of the initial vision, some of the options for the small scale actions, plans for small scale actions, learning points, etc., etc. So they're the things that we produce, or the milestones we hit along our route, along our way. Next one down is then some of the specific activities. What are we actually doing? And these, as a headline level, are the same as those blocks I've just talked through in terms of that framework. So it's about creating vision, it's about defining objectives, it's about exploring different options and ideas, it's about doing some small scale actions, testing and refining actions and so on and so forth. So there's a set of activities we need to map out as well. And then underneath that, the key bit is how that links in with the ULG work, how that links in with ULG meetings or other ULG activity. Now, some of that activity at a local level might be contributing to that activity on the next tier up. But we need to be clear when the ULG is meeting and what other activities are going on. So as an example here, I've put a working group separately in there as one of the ways that people sometimes work to tackle specific activities. They have certain working groups that take on particular tasks for or within the ULG. And then the final bit at the bottom is that link to the transnational work, so to our DigiPlace transnational network level work. So we have a number of different DigiPlace clusters planned out. We might start to get to some physical face-to-face meetings as we go through, but there will be a number of things that are programmed in at transnational level which will have certain themes, and we need to think about how your local activity links in with that transnational activity as well. So just as an example, in the run-up to a particular transnational meeting, you need to think about the ULG activity immediately before to prepare, and immediately afterwards to deal with what comes out of that meeting as well. So as we go through the timeline, we need to think about how you schedule the meetings so they connect up, but also how at a local level you might interact with working groups to deliver other things within your plan. So it might be as we go through and draw out the timeline, you might want to have a version that draws these links explicitly to show how the rationale for the different activities all fits together at a local level. So that gives us two key components for building the IAP roadmap. It gives us a framework of the key things we need to do and step through the key stages we need to consider. And it also gives us a model for a detailed timeline, so we can start to plot those activities based around different levels, whether that's local level, transnational level, and picking out how those things contribute to the production of the action plan in 2022 or by 2022. So this gets you most of the way there to producing your roadmap with these things. If you want to present it, you may need additional information as well to include in the roadmap, particularly in terms of the baseline position and the starting point, but also about resources or who's assigned to activities and some of the details of what the specific activities and those little notes look like. But these two components give us the sort of key, some of the key framework and the key timeline to start to put it together. And that's what we'll do working together over the next couple of months. The other thing to consider is that the roadmap should probably evolve as the project evolves. So whilst we're going to produce a roadmap as part of this first activation stage of the project, we do need to respond to what happens on the ground. So don't build it and think it's going to be fixed, because there will probably be situations that occur, particularly as we're having to work digitally now, and we don't know actually when we're going to be able to physically meet again during the project. So it needs to be a living document, it needs to evolve, and you need to respond to the situation you find in front of you and update the roadmap as required as you go through. So that's the key introduction to the roadmap. We'll get into it in a bit more detail in subsequent conversations, but it's just to give you an overview and help you understand what it is we're trying to produce as part of producing the IAP roadmap and what that's intended to achieve. So once again, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to working with you in the sessions very, very soon. Okay, thank you. Bye.